That quote sums up the story we're about to unpack. Because when it comes to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, better known as Mormonism, comfort and truth rarely exist in the same room. This isn't about mocking people's faith. It's about understanding how something that began as a fringe religious movement in the 1800s became one of the wealthiest and most secretive organizations in America, and how it continues to shape lives through control, fear, and manipulation, all under the banner of divine revelation. Let's start at the beginning. In 1820, a young man named Joseph Smith claimed he saw God the Father and Jesus Christ in a forest in New York. They supposedly told him that every existing church was wrong, and that he would be the one to restore the true gospel. A few years later, he said an angel named Moroni led him to golden plates buried in a hillside. On those plates, written in a mysterious language no one else had ever seen, was the story of an ancient civilization in the Americas. He said he translated those plates using seer stones placed inside a hat. Then he published what we now know as the Book of Mormon. From there, things took off fast. Smith built a following, ordinary people who believed they were part of a divine plan. But as with most self-proclaimed prophets, power began to grow faster than reason. The movement gained momentum through charisma, promises of salvation, and the idea that everyone else had been misled. And that's the thing about belief. Once people are convinced they've found the one true church, every contradiction starts to look like a test of faith rather than a red flag. Early Mormonism was filled with secrecy and radical practices. Joseph Smith introduced plural marriage, what we now call polygamy. He told his followers that God commanded men to take multiple wives, often including teenagers, and even the wives of other men. For Smith, it wasn't about love, it was about control, legacy, and the power to bind people's loyalty through divine fear. By the time outsiders started questioning it, the damage was done. Families fractured, women were silenced, and dissenters were branded as enemies of God. And when the outside world didn't accept their message, Mormons retreated further inward. They built their own cities, created their own laws, and developed a culture of absolute obedience to church leaders. In the 1840s, Smith declared himself a political candidate and formed a private militia. That didn't end well. He was eventually killed by an angry mob while awaiting trial in Illinois. After his death, Brigham Young took control and led thousands of followers west to what's now Utah. There, they built a new society, isolated, self-sufficient, and ruled entirely by the church. This wasn't just a religion anymore, it was a theocracy. Every aspect of life was tied to church authority: marriage, education, property, even clothing and speech. Loyalty wasn't just expected, it was mandatory. The church claimed revelation after revelation, but every revelation seemed to benefit the men in charge. When polygamy became inconvenient for their political ambitions, a new revelation suddenly declared it unnecessary. When the US government threatened their tax-exempt status, another revelation adjusted church policy to align with federal law. That's the pattern. Revelation as a tool, not as truth. For decades, the Mormon Church barred black members from holding the priesthood. It wasn't until 1978, more than a decade after the civil rights movement, that leaders claimed to receive a divine message reversing the policy. But conveniently, that revelation came only after the church faced social and political backlash. When morality depends on convenience, revelation starts to look suspiciously like PR management. But it doesn't stop there. Behind the wholesome image, the smiling missionaries, the family-friendly ads, the clean-cut culture, lies a system designed for total control. Members are taught to report each other's behavior. Doubt is treated like disease. Leaving the church means losing your community, your friends, sometimes even your family. That's not spiritual freedom, that's social captivity. Every Sunday, members are reminded to obey church leaders as if they speak directly for God. To question them is to question God himself. It's a structure built on authority, reinforced through guilt and fear. Financially, the church is an empire. In 2019, a whistleblower revealed that the LDS Church secretly held over $100 billion in investment funds, tax-free, all while preaching modesty and sacrifice to its members. They tell followers to tithe 10% of their income, not as a donation, but as a requirement for salvation. You can't enter the temple, the most sacred space in Mormonism, unless you're a full tithe payer. In other words, access to heaven has a price tag, and when that much money flows into one organization, accountability disappears. The church claims to be transparent, but refuses to disclose its finances publicly. Members have no idea where their money goes, who benefits from it, or how it's used, and yet they're told it's all part of God's plan. But let's be clear, this isn't just about money, it's about the psychology of belief. From a young age, Mormons are taught that they are part of a divine story, that they have eternal purpose, that their church is perfect, and that questioning it is a moral failure. When that belief is internalized, it becomes nearly impossible to separate truth from programming. That's what cults do best. They replace independent thought with moral dependency, and the techniques are subtle. Constant community involvement keeps members busy. Regular worthiness interviews create shame around personal behavior. Young people are sent on missions where they're isolated from the outside world and pressured to recruit others. It's a system that reinforces itself. You believe because you're told to. You stay because you're afraid not to. Many former members describe the emotional toll of leaving as worse than divorce or death, because it's not just losing a belief system, it's losing your identity. And when you've spent your entire life being told that outsiders are deceived, leaving feels like betrayal. But that's how control works, by convincing you that the cage is protection. Today, the church tries to appear more open, more progressive, but its roots haven't changed. Its structure still demands obedience, its hierarchy still silences dissent, and its narrative still relies on unverified claims. And yet millions remain devoted, not because they've weighed the evidence, but because belonging feels safer than questioning. That's the paradox of faith-based institutions built on control. They thrive not on truth, but on fear of losing it. The Mormon story isn't just a religious one, it's a human one. It's about how easily people can be convinced that submission is virtue, how charisma can masquerade as revelation, and how the desire for certainty can blind entire generations to manipulation. But the cracks are showing. Every year, more members leave, more stories come out, more people begin to see that doubt isn't evil, it's honest, because the truth doesn't fear questions, only lies do. And when a church threatens eternal punishment for curiosity, that's not faith, that's control. The story they don't want you to hear isn't about sin or salvation, it's about power, about what happens when belief becomes a weapon, and when loyalty becomes more important than truth. People don't leave Mormonism because they're angry. They leave because they've finally realized that the same system claiming to set them free has been holding them hostage. And once you see it, once you really see it, you can't unsee it. That's the real revelation. When people think of Mormonism, they usually picture polite young men in white shirts and ties, clean families, modest living, strong morals, and on the surface, that's not wrong. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that this clean image isn't a reflection of truth, it's a strategy. From the start, the church has mastered the art of image control. Every photograph, every ad, every missionary script, all carefully curated to make Mormonism look modern, rational, and trustworthy. But behind that PR machine, there's an unspoken rule: never make the church look bad, even if it means hiding abuse, denying history, or silencing victims. For decades, the LDS Church has been accused of covering up sexual abuse within its congregations. Church leaders insist they handle these cases internally, but that's exactly the problem. Victims are told to report abuse to their bishops, men with no legal or psychological training, who then contact the church's legal hotline instead of the police. And that hotline exists not to protect victims, but to protect the institution. In one case, a father confessed to repeatedly abusing his children. The bishop called the church hotline, was told to remain silent, and no report was ever made to law enforcement. The abuse went on for years. The church later argued in court that it had no obligation to report it, and they won. That's not moral leadership. That's moral corruption dressed in holy language. When religion claims divine authority but shields predators, it ceases to be spiritual. It becomes structural, a machine protecting itself at all costs. The same pattern appears in how the church handles history. Official manuals once taught that Native Americans were descended from Israelites who came to America on boats 600 years before Christ. But when DNA evidence completely disproved that claim, the church quietly changed the wording in its online scriptures. No public apology, no acknowledgement, just silent revision. This rewriting of the past isn't accidental, it's survival. Because the moment people start connecting the dots, the foundation begins to crumble. Take the story of the golden plates. The church claims Joseph Smith returned them to the angel Moroni after translating them, so there's no physical evidence they ever existed. The only proof comes from a handful of witnesses, all of whom were close friends or relatives of Smith, many of whom later left the church and admitted they never saw the plates with their natural eyes, only through spiritual vision. In any other context, that would sound like a con, but within a religious frame, it becomes sacred mystery. That's how belief protects itself, by redefining evidence. When proof doesn't exist, The absence of it becomes a sign of deeper faith. But faith isn't the issue here. It's the power built on faith that's dangerous. Because once people surrender their critical thinking, leaders can justify anything. The temple rituals are another example. They're presented as sacred ordinances, but most members aren't told what happens inside until after they commit. Participants wear special clothing, make secret oaths, and promise absolute obedience to the church. These ceremonies closely resemble Freemasonry, something Joseph Smith was known to be involved with. When critics point that out, leaders say it's coincidence, but when you compare the rituals line by line, the overlap is undeniable. And then there's the temple garments, often called magic underwear by outsiders, though that's not how members see it. They believe the garments offer spiritual protection, a physical reminder of their covenants. But the underlying message is obedience. Your body, your clothing, your privacy, all belong to the church. Everything is tied to compliance. Even after leaving, many ex-members talk about the psychological residue, the guilt, the fear of punishment, the nightmares about eternal separation from family. Decades of conditioning doesn't vanish overnight. That's the emotional architecture of control. You don't need bars to build a prison if you can make people afraid of the outside. The church's structure ensures that every member is accountable to someone above them. Bishops report to stake presidents report to area authorities, all the way up to the quorum of the 12 apostles and the president, who is considered a living prophet. And yet these prophets are often silent when moral courage would matter most. During the AIDS crisis, the church condemned homosexuality as sinful and refused to support safe-sex education, even as young people in Utah died. Decades later, leaders still call same-sex relationships contrary to God's law. They say it's about love and truth, but the harm is measurable. Elevated suicide rates, family rejection, mental health crises. When kindness depends on conformity, it's not kindness. It's control through conditional acceptance. And that's the thread that runs through it all. The illusion of choice in a system that punishes freedom. Even in small things, the control is there. Members are told what kind of clothes to wear, what kind of food or drink to avoid, what media to consume, even what kind of thoughts are appropriate. Coffee is forbidden. Alcohol is taboo. Tattoos are discouraged, not because they're inherently wrong, but because they symbolize independence. When everything you do must align with church approval, autonomy becomes rebellion. And yet, Mormons are told this is freedom, freedom from sin, freedom through obedience. But real freedom doesn't come from submission. It comes from self-awareness. When people finally question the structure, the reaction is swift. Friends stop calling, family withdraws, leaders warn that Satan is deceiving them. It's not a coincidence. It's a survival instinct built into the institution. If you can convince people that doubt equals danger, they'll police themselves. Some might say, but there's good in the church, community, charity, family values, and that's true. But good doesn't erase harm. The most dangerous systems aren't those that look evil, they're the ones that look righteous. That's what makes Mormonism so effective. It doesn't look like a cult, it looks like family. But it demands loyalty like a cult, it isolates dissenters like a cult, and it punishes independence like a cult. When a system requires constant obedience to preserve peace, it's not peace. It's compliance dressed as harmony. And the thing is, the more people speak up, the more obvious that becomes. Former members are now building online communities, sharing stories, comparing experiences, realizing that what they thought was just them was actually the design. The church can't control that. Not anymore. The internet has done what prophets never could. It's leveled the playing field. You can read the original documents, the contradictions, the cover-ups, the leaked policies, all without needing anyone's permission. For the first time, truth isn't locked in a temple, it's a click away, and the truth is uncomfortable, but it's also liberating, because once you see how belief can be used to control, you start to recognize it everywhere, in governments, corporations, even relationships. The Mormon Church is just one example of a bigger human story, the story of how we trade freedom for certainty. Certainty feels good, but it's a cage. Real growth comes from admitting what we don't know, from facing uncomfortable facts, from asking the questions that systems of power forbid. That's why people leave, not because they've lost faith, but because they've finally chosen truth over comfort. And maybe that's what this entire story has been about, not just the cult of Mormonism, but the cult of certainty itself. Because when you stop needing to be sure, when you stop needing someone else to tell you what's true, that's when freedom begins. The story of Mormonism isn't just about one church. It's about what happens when belief becomes a business, when power hides behind piety, and when truth is whatever authority says it is. It's easy to look at the early days and think, That was just the 1800s. Things were different then. But the mechanisms haven't changed. Only the packaging has. Today, Mormonism markets itself with sleek websites, PR-trained leaders, and influencer families on social media, smiling faces, clean homes, perfect marriages, the kind of image that makes you think maybe they really have it figured out. But that's the illusion, because beneath the surface lies the same machinery of control, the expectation to conform, to obey, to never question the men at the top. And that hierarchy, despite all the talk of equality and family, remains almost entirely male. Women in the church are praised for their divine role, but it's a role defined by men. They can't hold the priesthood, they can't lead at the highest levels, and they're often told their worth comes from motherhood. It's packaged as love, but it's really limitation. When you tell someone their purpose is predetermined, you're not honoring them, you're owning them. And that mindset extends beyond gender. It reaches into sexuality, identity, thought, even emotion. Mormonism teaches that feelings of doubt come from evil influence, that questioning authority means spiritual weakness. But the truth is, doubt isn't corruption, it's curiosity, and curiosity is the foundation of every honest life. The church knows that. That's why it fights so hard to suppress it. Because once curiosity starts, it spreads. One question leads to another, and eventually the entire structure starts to look fragile. That's why the internet has been such a threat to Mormonism. Information doesn't stay buried anymore. Members can read early church records, historical letters, inconsistencies in the Book of Mormon, or the testimonies of those who left. And once they see the gaps, the spiritual answers no longer satisfy. You can't unlearn what you've discovered, and no prayer meeting can erase the feeling of being lied to. For many who leave, the hardest part isn't losing faith, it's rebuilding trust, learning how to think without guilt, how to live without someone else defining what's good or evil. It's like waking up from a dream where everything felt certain, only to realize certainty was the trap. And yet leaving doesn't make you a villain. It makes you human, because humans are wired to seek truth. We crave meaning, but we also crave honesty, and no institution should ever demand that we sacrifice one for the other. Mormonism's story is a reminder that even the most polished systems can hide deep dysfunction, that behind every smiling missionary might be a young person taught to fear their own thoughts. That's not spirituality, that's conditioning. And when you strip away the theology, the revelations, the rituals, what's left is a system built on obedience, secrecy, and money. Three things that have corrupted every empire since the beginning of history. It's not unique. It's just another version of the same old story, power disguised as purity. But there's something powerful about walking away, about realizing that you don't need to be chosen to be complete, that morality doesn't require scripture and purpose doesn't require permission. People sometimes say leaving religion leaves a hole, but maybe that hole isn't emptiness. Maybe it's space for your own thoughts, your own values, your own sense of wonder. Because when you finally stop being told what's true, you get to discover it for yourself. And that's what makes truth so uncomfortable. It demands honesty instead of obedience. The church will say that leaving leads to darkness, that without faith, life is meaningless. But if your light only shines when someone else controls the switch, was it ever really yours? The people who leave often describe a strange feeling at first, fear mixed with freedom, then gradually peace, not the kind promised in sermons, but the quiet peace that comes from being real, from no longer pretending to believe what you can't. It's a kind of peace you can't buy, can't pray into existence, can't fake. That's the story they don't want you to hear, that freedom doesn't come from obedience. It comes from honesty. And once you see how faith and fear have been tied together to control minds, you start to understand why so many people stay silent. Because speaking truth in a world built on lies is dangerous, but necessary. Every movement toward progress began with someone willing to question, someone who refused to bow to revelation when it contradicted reason, someone who decided that truth, even painful truth, was worth more than comfort. And maybe that's the lesson of Mormonism's rise and fall, that no belief system should ever be immune to evidence, no leader should ever be above accountability, and no God should ever need to hide behind lawyers, secrecy, or fear. The cult of Mormonism isn't just a story about religion, it's a story about humanity's capacity to surrender and our potential to wake up, because belief is powerful, but awareness is liberating. And when you start to see clearly, you realize that truth was never hiding. It was just buried under layers of fear, tradition, and loyalty. So the next time someone tells you that questioning is dangerous, remember this: the most dangerous thing in the world isn't doubt, it's blind faith. And the moment you stop letting someone else define truth for you, you've already left the cult. That's the story they don't want you to hear.